Our speaker tonight is Ryan Sitton. He's the Republican nominee for Railroad Commission, so we'll have an opportunity to vote for him in November. Ryan is a native Texan, graduated from Texas A&M University, where he obtained a degree in mechanical engineering and met his future wife, Jennifer. In 2006, Ryan and Jennifer founded Pinnacle AIS, an engineering and technology company focused on reliability and integrity programs for the oil and gas and petrochemical industries. Since 2006, Pinnacle has experienced substantial growth, recently surpassing 300 employees. Inc. magazine recognized Pinnacle in 2012 and in 2013 as one of the top 1,500 fastest growing privately held companies in the world. Pinnacle AIS has also been part of the coveted Aggie 100, which celebrates and recognizes the fastest growing Aggie-owned businesses for three consecutive years. Ryan has over 15 years of experience in oil and gas and petrochemical industry, and recently gained the Republican nomination for a Railroad Commission. And I might say that Ryan is one of the few people that has run for the Railroad Commission that actually has a lot of oil and gas experience. Anyway, Ryan, let's welcome him.
If I just talk, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, sure.
Why would I turn this off? It's self-destruct. Okay. My parents are both teachers, so it's a matter of family pride that I can get up and talk to a room this size without having to use a microphone. If they knew I used a microphone, I'd never be let back into the house. Well, thank you guys for having me here tonight. I love actually this size group because hopefully we can have a little dialogue tonight. As you know, I'm running for the Texas Railroad Commission, and what hopefully most of you know that will differentiate you from the rest of the people around the state of Texas is that the Railroad Commission does nothing with railroads. One of the stories I like to tell, because it's so indicative of the name of this commission, is from back way a year and a half ago when my wife and I were talking about me running for this office. And I'll talk about what drove us to that decision in a minute, but talk about the conversation that we had with our children. So we put a lot of thought into this. You know that if you're going to run for office, it is a taxing experience, and it certainly takes its toll on you, on your family, on your children, on your business. And so it spend some time talking about it, spend time in prayer. By the time we decided, yeah, this is the right thing for us to do, we sat down with our kids. Our kids are Sarah, Luke, and Lance, and they are 10 and 8 and 5. And so we sit down and we say, well, kids, I'm going to run for office. And wow, okay, well, what are you going to run for? Well, I'm going to hopefully be the next Texas Railroad Commissioner. Yay! Do we get to ride on train? What can we do? And then you shovel coal? It doesn't have anything to do with trains. Boo. My daughter actually asks me, Daddy, is that what they call false advertising? On the mouths of babes, right? I mean, it's so true. And what's interesting about that is that here we are, the largest energy producing state in the world. Texas was its own country. I think now we're up to 8th or 7th in the world. If we were our own country, we'd be the 7th or 8th largest oil producer in the world. And yet, across the state of Texas, somewhere around 3% of our citizens know that the Railroad Commission regulates oil and gas. Right now, as this industry is growing, and the energy industry around the world is changing in ways it has not changed in literally 100 years. Things are moving so quickly right now, and I'll talk more about those in a minute, but at a time when things are changing so dramatically, and it is having literally generational impacts, what's happening right now, people have no idea. It's a shame. It's one of the things that I want to work on, assuming I'm able to be successful in November. And the reason it is important that we come out and connect with folks like you, folks who have chosen to step out from their living rooms and their televisions and their jobs and come be a part of a grassroots effort, is because it is so important right now to connect. When only 3% of the people know that the Railroad Commission regulates oil and gas, you all represent now a pretty big chunk of who actually knows that around this thing. And it's important that we talk about it. So let me talk a little bit more about why we decided to run for this office, and then I'll talk about what is happening out there right now. Why is the Railroad Commission and Texas oil and gas so critical? And then hopefully I'll be done in time for us to have some questions. And like I said, this size group is perfect for some real dialogue. I hope you guys will ask real questions, things that are concerning to you, things you want to understand more, things that I'd just like to learn something about all this oil and gas stuff. Hopefully I'll be able to answer that question. So, why run for this office? As John mentioned, and I mentioned, grew up in Irving, native Texan. My parents both teachers. Got into A&M, got a mechanical engineering degree, got out and immediately went into the oil business. Spent my time first with Oxy, and then went to Marathon. And then in 2006, Jennifer and I started our own company. And we have been so blessed. And the oil industry has become very personal for me because, growing up, we didn't have a lot of extra money. I mean, we certainly didn't hang around with millionaires and billionaires. Parents were teachers. Our vacations were camping trips, and it was once a week we'd go out to dinner, and man, we're going to Furr's Cafeteria. I mean, we were thrilled. We had a great house growing up, but what an amazing opportunity to start our own business in this oil and gas business. And actually now we employ almost 400 people. Do business all over the world. I have personally been to Canada, South America, the Middle East, Europe, Australia, Malaysia, you name it. I've been all over this world. And I've seen all sorts of amazing things as we see energy develop and the role that energy plays in modern society all around the world. I mean, it is unbelievable to see this. And then to come back to the United States and to hear people denigrate the energy industry, to talk negatively about what we do, to talk about, as if we don't care about the environment, as if, we don't care about landowners, we don't care about surface rights, we don't care about anybody but making a dollar selling oil, which I can tell you as somebody who's in the business and who does business with people, it could not be further from the truth. And it strikes a very personal chord in you when you hear that. But the problem is, even in the state of Texas, where we are a very conservative, pro-business, pro-energy state, some folks have started to take oil and gas for granted. I'll contrast that if you go up to North Dakota right now. The North Dakota oil and gas industry has basically started in the last 10 years. And it is changing that state from the ground up. Up there, this is a revolution for them. They're so excited about new infrastructure and schools and educational programs, all driven by this brand new private industry that they've never seen before. In Texas, we've just always known it to be there. And right now, as these big opportunities are happening and huge things changing, people in the state of Texas are asking legitimate questions. We hear that oil and gas uses a lot of water. Is that true? Is that something I should be concerned about? That's a legitimate question. We hear up in Azle that disposal wells cause earthquakes. Is that something I should be concerned about? We hear that new infrastructure is going in, roads and pipelines, and that this darn thing called eminent domain might be used. And boy, that rubs us all the wrong way. Is that something I should be concerned about? These are legitimate questions, and they shouldn't be answered in the language of politics. That's not a Republican or a Democrat, a conservative or a liberal. That is a citizen's question, and needs to be answered in the language of science and the language of knowledge. I'll be the first engineer to serve as a railroad commissioner in 50 years. And I feel like having that kind of expertise right now, that kind of experience, could be really valuable. As people have real questions and want to know what's going on, can answer those questions in a language of science and data and protocol and engineering standards, I think that's going to be real valuable. And as we see these opportunities unfold in front of our state over the next 5 to 10 years, being that representative, being that employee of all of the voters of Texas, I think I can make a difference. And that's what drove me to run for this office. So let me talk a little bit about what are these big things that are happening around us. In 1929 in Mexico, you could be a private mineral owner in Mexico in 1929, or prior to 1929. In other words, just like in the United States and the state of Texas, you could own minerals invest your private dollars to develop those minerals, sell those minerals on the open market. In 1929, the government of Mexico said no more. And they nationalized all of the oil and gas in the country. From then on, Pemex, or Petroleum de Mexico, Pemex, which is the national oil company of Mexico, has been the only entity to develop oil and gas onshore and offshore in Mexico since 1929 until today. Right now, south of the border, the president of Mexico is undoing 80 years of legislation, almost 85 years of legislation, changing the game, because they've realized the Eagle Ford Shale, which has been tremendous for us down in South Texas, it stretches down into Mexico. And the president of Mexico has realized we can't compete. We can't compete with those guys across the Rio Grande. We don't have the capital, we don't have the wherewithal, and because we don't have capitalism in this industry, we don't have private competition, we can't compete. And they've said, my God, we're going to compete. And right now in Mexico, the president of that country is sending the message out across the world to oil and gas private investment saying, we are open for business. We're going to do everything it takes to make Mexico, he's telling them, to make Mexico easy to develop national resources. And they're looking right across the Rio Grande saying, we'd like that capital, we'd like that infrastructure, we'd like that know-how to come right here. We've got to be aware of that. They are in direct competition with us right now. And what's going on in the state of Texas? In fact, what's our president doing? That's not the message he sent. Even in Texas, the city of Denton, Texas, up just north of Dallas, has a moratorium, a ban on fracking on the ballot in November, when the citizens inside the city limits of Denton go to the polls to vote for Railroad Commission and whatever else that they feel like doing. They'll have on the top of that ballot a ballot initiative. Would you like to vote to ban fracking inside the city limits? That's unbelievable. Right now, across the border in Mexico, they're doing everything they can to make it easy to develop. In our own state, cities, municipalities are making it more difficult. People are asking questions around water, like I said. People are asking questions around earthquakes. Right here in our state, where we are being fed a lot of information. As we know, the media loves to do whatever they can to sell newspapers and sell ads. And that means fanning the flames of controversy. It doesn't do us any good to read it. If you're in the media, it doesn't do you any good to run a story that says earthquakes show data that may have somewhat slight implications on blah blah blah. What you want to do is oil and gas causes earthquakes. That's how you sell newspapers. So we've got to be very diligent. What else is going on in oil and gas around here? I don't know if any of you guys heard, but this country, Russia, is doing some pretty aggressive things in the Ukraine. Do you know how they're funding that? Russia has cornered the European natural gas market. In Europe right now, 40% of the natural gas that's used in Europe is purchased from Russia. They're making literally billions of dollars a week selling natural gas. And in the wintertime, it just ramps off the scale. And with all those resources, they can fuel a renewed military agenda. Energy is so crucial to societies around the world. It was in the 1970s, after the first and second Middle East oil embargo, when then President Carter came on television and issued a public statement that said, we are in dire straits. We've got a problem, he says. And by the way, part of what he was saying was correct, because they had realized, oh my gosh, this Middle East oil embargo told us we are way too dependent on foreign oil. He was coming out being very frank with the American people, said, we're in bad shape here. We have become so dependent on these guys that their ability to manipulate oil prices and supplies has a detrimental impact on our economy. And then he came out and said, we've got to have an entire plan to reduce usage on oil. That is, if someone asks you today, here's a trivia question, if someone asks you today, when was the last time a president issued an energy policy? It was Jimmy Carter in 1970. We have not had a new energy policy in this country since 1979. That's a tragedy. That is a tragedy that no president stepped up and said, that energy policy was based on zero reserves and an economy threatened by Middle East dominance on oil. Look at where we are today. Our oil imports have dropped from 60% down to 40% in the last 6 years alone. Current Energy Information Agency statistics say by the end of 2016, it'll be down to 20% of our oil imports. The world is changing on energy faster than it has in 100 years. And yet, we're still operating under an energy plan from 1979. We have got to think about competition on not just a state and a national, but on a global scale. It's time to think beyond energy independence. It was in 1979, by the way, in Carter's speech in the 1970s, when the words energy independence entered our lexicon, when we began to use that in common dialogue. We should be energy independent. I think it's time for us to think beyond energy independence. How do we get to a point that we are not just energy independent? How do we get to a point 5, 10 years down the road where instead of people talking about what OPEC is doing when it comes to oil prices, they're talking about what Texas is doing? How do we get to a point where when it comes to global oil and gas prices, we, the United States and Texas, because of our production, our leadership, our know-how, we are the ones dominating oil and gas prices? Imagine the impact of that. The same Russia scenario I was just talking about. This last winter, when most of us were heating our homes with natural gas, we were paying between $4 and $5 an MSCF. In Europe, they were paying over $12 an MSCF, nearly 3 times as much, because there's no competition. Another trivia question. How much natural gas, in terms of years, do we have in the United States today? It's about 100 years. About 100 years of natural gas right here. And that's not counting the undiscovered reserves. That's just the, what we call developed or potentially developable reserves. 100 years of natural gas, and yet we're not competing in Europe with these Russians. The world is changing, and it's time for us to compete. So, all right, Ryan, you're going to be the railroad commissioner. That's an interesting couple of points. What do you do about that as a railroad commissioner? Three top things. First of all, our commission's got to be a very efficient, very effective agency today. We've got to be an example of how good regulation is done. A lot of people are confused about the fact that they think a lot of oil and gas companies want no regulation. That is far from the truth. They want good, consistent regulation. They know it just takes one bad actor to give the entire industry a bad name. And they want to know when they do good business, they use good engineering principles, they make good deals with landowners and mineral owners, that they don't get penalized because the guy across the street doesn't have to do that. They want rules that say all of us have to be good actors. All of us have to follow industry best practice. So we have to be an example to the not so efficient federal government about how good regulation is done. How do we work with industry to identify best practice and utilize that in our standards? How do you identify true bad actors, and what do you do about it? That's where the Railroad Commission can be so good and so strong and in such a position of leadership. Staying out in front, making sure that other states, other nations are following our lead. The second thing, we want to make sure that when we deal with people inside the state of Texas, that they understand what we do. We need to do much more outreach than we've ever done before. If you are a private citizen, you're a mineral owner, you're an operator, you're a school teacher, I don't care. If you've got a question about oil and gas in the state, you need to be able to call the Railroad Commission and get a person who's knowledgeable on the phone with you, letting you know what's going on. That's a real aggressive plan when you think of the volume and the size of the state. The last thing as a Railroad Commission, the third thing we need to do is generate a state energy plan. And as I say that always has given me pause in the past, because a lot of us hear energy plan and we hear subsidies and mandates. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about simply articulating what are the opportunities in front of us. Where do we see, based on the trends in the free market today, where do we see the trends going? What are going to be the demands for energy? How will we fulfill those demands in our private industry? How will we work with the rest of the states in this union to supply our energy needs? And then finally, how do we see ourselves competing on a global scale? How do we stay ahead of the Russians and the Mexicans and the South Americans and the Australians and the Canadians and everyone else who is chomping at the bit to take our place as the energy leader? If we do those three things well, my hope is that 10 years from now, we achieve these things we're talking about, that we are leading not just to energy independence, but to being a global dominant force on energy once again. And that starts right here, because once again, people have no idea what the Railroad Commission does. So this is not a campaign or a debate that's going to happen on national television between now and November. It's going to happen right here. And if we all carry that message well, then we will start this process off for the future. So, let me close there. And we'll see what questions you guys have. Yes, sir.
On the fracking issue, of course, people complain about the amount of water. And then I was reading an article about how by injecting nitrogen or something into the well, so you might have to use water or other compression. What you're hearing about that?
Yeah, great question. So there's two questions there. First one is, what about the amount of water that's used in fracking? And the second one is, what alternatives are there to water in fracking? Let me answer the second one first. There are alternatives. You can frack using natural gas, as a matter of fact. You put it into sort of a gel compound, liquefied petroleum gas. The challenge with doing that is that it can be dangerous. I mean, if you think about it, when you're using a highly flammable compressed liquid, it can be very, very dangerous to do that. There's alternatives to fresh water using brackish water and recycled produced water. And a lot of that is already going on in the state right now. And those developments are moving very quickly. And it's not being driven, by the way, by government mandates. It's being driven by private industry looking for alternatives in areas where water is harder to come by or water is too expensive. So a lot of that development is already being done. So let me get now to the first question. And this is a great question because it is huge. Y'all see my pie graph up here? I know it's a little rudimentary, but bear with me. This is a pie graph of all the water used in the state of Texas for everything that we use it for. And I'm going to show you these slivers here. I'll focus on this one right now. And this is the amount of water used for hydraulic fracturing in the state of Texas in 2013. It was 26 billion gallons of water. And that's the story that you would read in the newspaper. 26 billion gallons of water used for hydraulic fracturing. And that makes us all go, gosh, that's a lot of water. Now, what you don't hear often in the newspaper, in fact, you will probably have never seen this graph. We have it, we haven't publicized it yet, but we are going to soon. Is that represents 0.4% of all the water used in the state of Texas. When you think of 26 billion gallons, that's a massive number. But it's 0.4% of all the water used in the state of Texas. I want to now look at this pie piece right here. This pie piece is the amount of water that's used to water lawns. It is 20 times as much water. Now, I don't know how much state revenue was generated by lawn watering last year. I can pretty much guarantee it was negligible. Oil and gas generated $3 billion in production taxes, severance taxes alone. It's not even counting property taxes. It's not counting employment taxes if we work in that industry. So when you think of us as a state and how we use as a group, how we allocate our water, if you told me I can use 0.4% to produce $3 billion of state revenue, or I can use about 8% and get zero, one seems like a better use of water, and just in terms of state revenue. Now, another way to look at that is this. If we could go out and say, I can do away with all that 0.4%, drive the cost of oil and gas through the roof and make it very difficult on some producers around the state, or all of us that water our lawn for an hour, if you can cut 2 minutes out of that hour, that will more than make up the amount for all the water that's used in fracking. So it's important to understand that the major impact. I actually am, by the way, a proponent of recycling water. We need to develop the technology. We need to look for opportunities to pool resources in certain municipalities where water is a real scarcity. I'm a big proponent of that. But what I think is a disservice to the citizens of the state of Texas is when you go on Google and you Google Texas water usage, oil and gas is over half the things you'll find. And I could eliminate every single ounce of water that's used in oil and gas today, not just in fracking, in drilling activities, in refining, and it will be a negligible impact to our long-term state water infrastructure challenges. When you look at population growth, agriculture, all the other places we use water, we've got to be talking about water across the board, not just oil and gas. And that's the shame of the media stories that you'll read that talk all about how oil and gas is using our water. Good question. What else? Yes, ma'am.
What would your plan be to deal with the EPA?
Very good question. Now, the EPA, as your railroad commissioner, I have very little authority to sue the EPA. That's Ken Paxton. My job as the Railroad Commission is to make sure that Ken Paxton's case is rock solid. His case is going to be, EPA, we are out in front on every rule, every regulation, that our engineering standards are leading the world. So that when he goes to sue the EPA, his #1 expert witness is Ryan Sitton. And I come in and tell, in a court of law, or where else this lawsuit's going to play out, how our standards are leading the way, how we are looking at new technology and new best practice all the time, and that other states and other nations even are following our lead. Because that makes the case for him that they've got no business here. And that's how we have continually, long before I ran for office, that's how we have continually won these lawsuits to beat the EPA, is by demonstrating that the science is on our side, and that we are continuing to stay in front of everybody.
My second part of that question is going to be, you've probably heard a little thing about a pipeline.
No, I'm not aware of
Yeah,
pipeline. What are you
okay.
talking about?
How does that play into dealing with the EPA and Texas as far as oil and gas and getting this thing done?
Yeah, sure. So in fact, I'm going to go a little dork on you here, so I'm going to apologize. But so a lot of us know, we feel like the Keystone Pipeline is important, but a lot of us don't know why it's important. So I'm going to give you a couple of quick anecdotes to explain why this is. It's the kind of stuff that you're ever really wanting to bore your friends at a party, you can talk about this. Okay, so I've just talked about how we're producing all this oil, and yet I'm also, Ryan Sitton, I'm in favor of building the Keystone XL pipeline. Now wait a minute, do we want energy independence or do we not? Because if I build the Keystone XL pipeline, aren't I buying crude from Canada? Why do I want to do that? What a great question I just asked myself, Ryan. That's where you have to get into the discussion about light sweet crude and heavy sour crude. What do those things mean really quickly? Heavy sour crude, is, the two terms heavy and sour. Heavy is very long hydrocarbon chains. It takes more money to break those apart and make them into combustible liquids. That's heavy. Light is, it doesn't have much, sweet is, I'll say the right term, sour is it has more sulfur in it. So if a crude has big, long hydrocarbon chains and it's got a lot of sulfur in it, it's much more difficult to refine and it costs more money. Light, sweet crude, smaller hydrocarbon molecules, and less sulfur is cheaper and easier to refine. What we produce in Texas is predominantly light, sweet crude, almost entirely actually. However, our refineries on the Gulf Coast have been geared up over the last 20 years to run heavy sour crude. Now, why would I want to run heavy sour crude? Because it's a lot cheaper. We normally talk about benchmark crudes as WTI and Brent. You ever heard those terms before? Most of us have never heard of Western Canadian Select. That is a benchmark crude in Canada. During the first 6 months of this year, Western Canadian Select traded at about a $25 discount to West Texas Intermediate. So if we were paying $95 for WTI here, we could have bought Western Canadian Select for $70. So the real opportunity for us in Texas is to get this Keystone XL pipeline built, bring that cheaper crude down to our U.S. refineries, run those refineries through that crude, sell that cheaper gasoline right back here into our country, into our state, take our Western Canadian, our WTI, and sell it overseas, which is why it's important to lift the crude ban. Now we can compete on a global scale with our very valuable crude product, and we still keep an energy advantage here in Texas. That's why the Keystone Pipeline is so critical, and almost nobody knows that. So how can we drive that, is the answer to your question. When I talked about that state energy plan, that's it. By putting something in writing that says, if you will work with us, we're going to create so many dadgum jobs. And I'm not saying we government. This industry is going to create so many jobs. And we are going to reverse 30% of the U.S. national trade deficit. Think about that number. Today, for every, I don't know what the trade deficit is today. I want to say something like $50 billion a month or something crazy. We can reverse a third of it just by exporting more crude, bringing down the cheaper sour stuff, and then exporting more refined products as well. It's game-changing stuff. By articulating that in a way that everyone goes, yeah, that's a good idea. Whereas a lot of people that just don't understand it. So we gotta put those things in. What else? Obviously, you can tell I get really excited about this. And, yeah, Christmas, man. This guy got hopped up on Monster or something. Yes, sir.
Hi, how are you?
Good. How are you?
My wife and I, we were running we were having the other guy to run against you, but we were so impressed.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you again.
But we were so impressed when we heard you speak last year. I'm looking at the future. The government is watching you guys very closely, and I noticed that one issue that they brought up, it was your business experience. Well, you do have a business experience, but you also own a gas company, so it is.
I don't own an oil and gas company.
Well, the energy, the business that you own,
Yes.
is that will interfere in the future?
So it's a good question, and in fact, I will tell you, one of the naive things that I had to learn during this campaign. So our company implements integrity programs. Nothing that we do is regulated by the Railroad Commission. Our customers, I mean, occasionally might, but if you look back at like all of the 450 or something companies that have gone before the Railroad Commission in the last 5 years, only like 5 of them were customers of ours. So I thought, you know what, even though this is great, I've got a lot of experience in the industry, but I don't do business for the Railroad Commission. My customers don't generally go before the Railroad Commission. If they do, I can recuse myself. There is no conflict. This will be great. Be a great marriage. The problem is that this is where I was naive, is to expect that that somehow that message would get out there on its own. Right? I mean, when people go, wait a minute, you're in the oil and gas business, these guys are oil and gas, there's a conflict here. It's a very fair question. So, look, what I want is that no one has any question about my motives. If we're going to work on challenging policy, if we're going to take on federal government agenda, we're going to take on federal regulatory agenda, especially if we're talking about things in the state of Texas that are challenging. There can't be any doubt about what's driving my priorities. So we are going to take some steps to basically put part or all of our company into a blind trust. I will step down as the CEO, and I will not have any direct connection with that business anymore. It's I won't say it's disappointing. I didn't expect that I would need to do that, but I just want to remove any doubt from people that that's going to be the case. So that's how we're going to handle it. Yes, sir.
As far as that question you just addressed is concerned, you know, I would much rather have a businessman that's in business and knows business running what should be a business than some community organizer that doesn't know a certain part of his anatomy from any other, you know what I mean? You got a blind squirrel out, every once in a while he'll find a nut, but I mean.
Well, I appreciate that, and obviously I agree with you, but I'm biased. I do agree, and I think that knowledge is really useful. And
You're a businessman.
but it's still a fair question, right? And I think
I don't think it's fair.
Okay, well, I appreciate that.
Unless somebody goes and investigates you and finds out you're paying all your buddies something like somebody else, what I just mentioned. And, you know, I mean, that's what I consider not fair, but they just continue to push aside any opposition and crew. I mean, you know, I'm not sorry. I'd rather see a businessman conducting our business like a business and rather than playing darts at a map of the world.
I appreciate that. Yes, sir.
I guess over the year period, we're about to lose all our coal, electricity generated by coal. That's supposed to happen now. I don't know if Texas itself, despite having a lot of coal plants, has a coal industry. And if we have a coal industry, would that be under your regulation? And if that's true, how do we reverse the stupidity?
So you've asked 3 very good questions. One is, and that's by the way 2 over your allotment of 1, but I'll dock points later. First is, do we have a coal industry? Second of all, would we lose the coal industry? And thirdly, how do we reverse that if that's the case? I think those are your questions. First one is
Would you be on with you?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, what I regulate. So the first one is yes, that coal mining is absolutely under the purview of the Railroad Commission. It's a good question. Second of all, in fact, I don't spend a lot of time, normally I don't talk about coal a lot, not because it's not crucial to our energy platform, just because that landscape is not changing near as dramatically as oil and gas is, which is what prompted me to run for this office. But that was before the EPA came out with its new 30% arbitrary CO2 reduction. And let me tell you, you want a really interesting, engineer geek anecdote about this. I'll tell you one in just a minute. So yes, we have a huge coal industry here. We've got some huge coal mines, and we've got some very large coal-fired power plants. In this state today, and I'm gonna miss my note, Mike, you can tell me if you know if I'm right or wrong, I think we roughly make as much electricity with natural gas as we do with coal still. Coal is still,
Yeah,
might still be the largest electricity producing source in this state.
it's about 50%.
Okay. I'd say natural gas is coming close now, but I
Yeah.
don't know if it's changed all the time. So here's the interesting piece. So the EPA comes out and passes a new regulation, let's just bypass the whole congressional law thing, we don't need that anymore. We'll go out, let's pass this arbitrary 30% reduction. And it's interesting, it's a 30% reduction on emissions. There is a technology, so let's back up, talk a little more oil for just a second, and I'll get back to coal. If you look at some of the big oil reserves out there in the state of Texas, there are some that are called residual oil zones, or ROZs, ROZs. And these residual oil zones, right now, when we talk about oil reserves in the state of Texas, we don't count those. Because some of these residual oil zones, which are huge, have literally billions of barrels of oil, we ignore because they can only be developed with large-scale CO2 injection, large-scale CO2 stimulation. Man, where on earth can we get a whole lot of CO2? Right now, there's technology being developed to capture CO2 being produced by coal-fired power plants, liquefy it, pipeline it up to the Permian Basin, go underneath the Wolfcamp and Sprayberry and other known oil fields, and go into this residual oil zone and add billions of barrels to our state's oil reserves. However, the EPA, in its infinite wisdom, has said, no, capture is not part of our thought process. We want to eliminate the emissions. So this is totally private industry, nothing to do with what I'm doing. Companies are going right now and saying, we are developing the technology to capture nearly 100% of the CO2 and use it to expand our oil reserves. But you guys want us to reduce by 30%, so leaving 70% going into the atmosphere and producing less and less energy with it. I mean, we have a better plan to do both, and your plan will kill them both. Kill both. I mean, it just shows a lack of wherewithal that is it's staggering sometimes. So, how can we reverse this stupidity? As I said, it's putting this information out there. It's saying, okay, we can go with your plan, and you'll reduce 30% of the emissions and simply drive the price of electricity through the roof in the state of Texas. That's your plan. Our plan is to capture 100% of the CO2, stimulate new oil reserves, and compete on the global scale. That's how we do it. That's what I said, we've got to be communicating a language of science. In a political debate, no one knows whose story is true, right? But if we talk in a language of science, technology, advancement, that's where we're going to win this thing every single time. What else? Yes, sir?
Sorry again.
No, it's okay.
Wind energy. I still see all those trucks going and carrying all these big
Propellers.
propellers.
Yeah.
What are we staying here in Texas? What are we doing?
So I'll give you, here is some more interesting, just sort of anecdotal information. Texas is the #1 or #2 wind power generator in the country. A lot of people don't know that. We generate more wind power here, I think, than every other state, maybe except one. We might be the top or we're #2. Most of it's up in the Panhandle. You go up in like the Lubbock area, northern Panhandle, where it's real flat, wind all the time. They have them up there.
There's several near Denton.
So, yeah, that's right. I mean, you go up in the Panhandle. I mean, it's like it looks like it's a wind farm. I mean, there's thousands of them.
There's three right
And it's interesting that there are some areas where wind can be a very viable power source. I'm all for it. If the market conditions make sense and someone wants to invest in the technology, anecdotal story, there's a refinery up in the northern part of the state, just outside of Dumas, Texas. And they built a wind farm next door because they wanted a reliable secondary system for electricity because tornadoes kept knocking out the power grid. So they decided on their own to build this power source. And they were able to manufacture with wind and store up basically redundant power source. Good for them. More power to them. When that's going on, I'm all for it. And I think there's chances for us to do that. The problem is when the government steps in and says, well, we're going to subsidize this. Because when you think about the subsidies for wind power, what that means is I'm going to take your tax dollars and I'm going to stick them into forcing a certain energy source. And at some point down the road, that subsidy is either going to go away or I'm going to continue to take money from you. Eventually, it'll probably go away. And now what happens to that power source? It's not sustainable. The market won't support it. The cost of producing that power are not matched by the revenue. So what happens then? Your energy prices go through the roof, or the market becomes destabilized. One of the big problems with sources like wind is it's inconsistent. Ultimately, people can control how we get the oil out of the ground. They can put it in a refinery, they take the fuels out, they take the natural gas out, they send it to a plant. That we can control. We have still not figured out a way to make the wind blow. So when the wind stops blowing and there's no electricity or not enough electricity, power grids go down. You get brownouts and all sorts of crazy things. So the wind and other alternative sources are great. And I think private companies should continue to invest in that technology and figure out where the opportunities are to use it. Awesome. The government shouldn't be mandating this. That's when you get into real problems. And you've seen that play out in other states across the board. But I think you'll continue to see wind farms grow in places where it makes sense. Private companies are figuring out that there is a good power source there, a good electricity source. If it makes sense to them, awesome. Yes, sir.
What exactly is your position on eminent domain and how that relates to property rights?
Yeah, very good question. Ultimately, so personal story for my family owns a very small ranch just outside of Corsicana, Texas. It's about 20 minutes west, and my mom's family owns it. And I think all of us, and I'm certainly guilty of this, I love to see our infrastructure grow in this state. I mean, I recognize the fact that we need roads, we need pipelines, we need power lines. I get all that. And I support all that right until it comes across my land, right? Now, no, not my land. My eminent domain should be should be used as a last resort. I mean, it should be, look, ultimately, we ought to have good negotiations with property owners, myself included. Someone's going to come in and run a power line across our property, which is what came up a while back. If we negotiate in good faith, and look, we think this is what our property is worth, and we're realistic about that. We're not trying to gouge anybody, but we're doing business in good faith. We want to have a minimal impact on the land, and we all do business in good faith. Generally, that stuff goes very well. We don't hear about the stories of when it goes well. What we hear about is when somebody got frustrated, somebody got mistreated. As a railroad commissioner, I don't have any control over that. Zero. So I'm just giving you a personal opinion. I recognize that eminent domain is a necessary evil. At some point, I say as a last resort, if you said, I've got to put this new road in, this new pipeline in, and I've got to cross major chunks of the state, and it's what we call common carrier, unfortunately, it's something that we have to deal with. It's a reality. Hopefully, and large pipelines are constructed all the time, they never use it because the operators do good business, they have good negotiation. I think as a state I understand why it's there. The railroad commissioner, I have zero power to grant it. The state grants and legislates how eminent domain is applied and the process by which people go through. That's all the legislature. The only way the Railroad Commission has any impact is the Railroad Commission determines who is and who is not a common carrier. In other words, if you're a pipeline being built to haul multiple companies' products, that is a common carrier. That is to the Railroad Commission to determine that. And then it's up to the legislature to grant the people building that pipeline the power of eminent domain. What else? How are we doing on time? Are you guys like, man, we're exhausted, we're going to get back on? Okay. Yes, ma'am?
Tough question. Why don't we
doubt it.
change the name?
Yeah, I know. You said, why don't we?
Yeah.
I don't know yet. I'm a big proponent of changing the name. I've been pretty public about that. And it's mainly because, once again, people don't know what the commission does. And at a time when it's crucial, we need to know that.
We do.
I've heard some reasons that I don't know. I haven't been able to validate or not. One of the reasons I've heard that people have backed off in the past was that there are apparently some agreements or documents in which the EPA or some other federal agency has recognized control over state regulation to the Railroad Commission. So some people have told me, if you change the name, those documents no longer would hold true, and now you would remove that granted authority by the federal government, if you want to call it that, not granted authority, but recognition of authority. I don't know if that's true. I've tried to find out. I can't find those documents. I just heard that. The other one I have heard is that if you look at the way the state constitution is constructed, that we elect railroad commissioners However, there's no actual state agency in the Constitution for the Railroad Commission, just the Railroad Commissioners. So if we change the name, there'd be a disconnect because the Constitution would have to be changed to reflect a different named commissioner. So, but I still understand why that's all that arduous. These are just the things I've heard. But you will see me very publicly saying that this is something, unless I find some reason otherwise, I'm a very ardent supporter of this change. Yes, sir.
In lieu of a name change, could they just not keep the Railroad Commission name and farm out, spin off all the things like trucking and transportation that the Railroad Commission does? They have a Texas Department of Transportation, yet the Railroad Commission is still the controller of transportation and trucking in Texas.
No, we're not anymore. No, we're not. That's the thing. We don't do anything with it anymore. The only thing that the Railroad Commission regulates is specifically when you are dealing with a high pressure, like propane movement. That's the only time the Railroad Commission gets involved. Almost everything transportation related is now with Texas Department of Transportation.
Really?
Yeah, and once again, but no, if you'd asked me 6 years ago, I didn't know that. I'm in the business. I didn't know that. That's scary.
That's true, because I have had visits where they're concerned about the propane tanks on reefer trucks.
Yep. So if you're hauling high pressure propane, the propane industry is regulated by the Railroad Commission. General trucking, railroads, construction roads, none of that's regulated.
I'm in trucking and I didn't know that.
Well, that's great. Thank you very much.
No, sir. The one request I'd make of you is go online, connect with us via Facebook or email. You can email what's the campaign? Campaign@ryansitton.com. Reach out to us, stay connected with us as we send out emails and newsletters. And certainly, if you ever have a question, please don't hesitate to call me, reach out, we'd love to visit with you. Thanks again for having me, Nolan.
Great, thank you, Ryan. That was really great. Appreciate it.